No, thank you. Look, sometimes I wonder myself how Mamadou became Mamadou. I think the first thing is, if I can start where I was born, right? I was born in Cameroon in a very small, not so wealthy area, if I may, and basically, went to preschool and studied elementary school there. We were roughly 120 plus kids per class. You didn't really have internet in those days, and after that, while I was doing that, at some point my father actually decided to go and try his luck in Europe. So my mom and I stayed behind. And I think he arrived in Germany and then France. And to be honest, his let's say his permit expired. to put it, with a bit of poetry. So he wanted to, he was passionate about music. So his parents didn't want him to do music, so he decided to go and work music in Europe, and he was working, in different, small bands to, in cabarets and things like that to entertain. And then he could justify a job, and he got his papers. And then he ended up having my mother to join him, and then I joined, as part of what you call in French le regroupement familial, which is in the early 80s, with a lot of immigrants that were called to work, to fill those gaps in jobs in Europe, and then they were allowed to bring their family across, which I was part of that whole, I would say, caravan, if I may. So a defining moment, I would say, when I was in school was when I was in high school. At the end of junior high school, the principal called my parents and told them, your kids shouldn't stay in school. And my mom, it was not easy to be a black family, let's say, at the time in Europe, right? And from an immigrant family, let's say. So my mom was in Paris suburb, right? So basically, and then she thought, okay, why don't you want my child not to stay in the school? He's top of his class and he's turbulent, but it's not a reason to fire him. And the principal said, no, it has nothing to do with that. Your child is bored, and I think he needs to be in an environment that stimulates him, intellectually, etc. So there was this school in Paris called Lycée Bullegrand. You might have heard of it. Where, which is basically the best high school, I think, in France, and where many, let's say, French leaders and Nobel Prize came from. So I was sent there. I think I was probably the only, let's say, sub-Saharan African at the time. And it was a great experience for me because I was surrounded by a lot of bright minds from across Europe, mostly, whose parents would have sent there. Very, very, indeed stimulating. And that's also where when I realized how privileged I had been. If I look back at where I was coming from, to the environment I found myself in now, from a very humble background in the middle of a third world country, and a few years later to be among some of the prime elite of Europe, if I can, the prime upcoming elite.
The world,
of Europe. Yeah, the world in many ways, yeah. So, because basically there, we were targeting either the Fields Medal or, you have a lot of, that was the mindset, so it was very interesting. And then I thought I had a huge responsibility because I was extremely lucky to have been given that chance, and to also have had some people along the journey who saw the potential and believed in me. And as an African, for me, I told my mom that, you know, it was very interesting to see what they were doing. And she said, you know, if you remember when you arrived in France as a child, you were so impressed by the level of development, infrastructure, lifestyle, and you told me a few hours after landing that one day you'll go back to Africa and you'll make sure it looks just like that. So it was quite an interesting moment. So I continued my journey, you know, as a student, but school was still boring, to be frankly honest. At least the way it was, you know, even if academically it was going well, but I thought that was not enough for me. So at 19, I started my first non-for-profit organization. It was called Afrique Tandem. And the idea, still based on that idea of giving back, was to gather young African students across Europe in this organization to work together in doing skills transfers back to Africa, and also empower and accompany young students that would be arriving in Europe, so that we could create a bit of a collective working on you know, really giving hope, but also accelerating at our level the development of the continent. So I was doing that in parallel to my activities as a student. So I did class préparatoire, and then French grande école, as they call it. I decided to focus on business, although I did love math and science, because I believe that the real gap was in leadership. You know, once you get the right type of leadership, then you can get science, technology, and everything else to flourish. So went to business school, majored in finance, and so we did actually with that. So I was carrying on that activities with those African students across Europe, and we did the first ever career forum for African diaspora to go back to Africa and work in you know, in African companies or multinationals, so that we could give them the opportunity to go back and share their knowledge, their skills, and help their continent develop. So I was kind of, again, having this double life, you know, at school during the day, and it's been a very much of a pattern, I have to say. We'll get to that later. Basically, it grew to have like 200 plus students across Europe, mainly coming from some of the best universities and schools, etc., and really working towards not only giving back, but you know, start putting the premises of a knowledge-based society. Really, that was in the late 90s. No, let's say no, the early 2000s, late 90s. Right, and internet was very nascent then, right? So when we kind of built libraries in Mali, you know, other African countries, we also started sensitizing people around e-commerce even before it got big. So we could see that that would be the chance for, you know, craftsmen, small manufacturers, artists, to get the world to know their talent by using the internet and using e-commerce as a way. And we did like training and entrepreneurship competitions around internet and technology for Africa to embrace this new world. After I graduated, I mean, I was actually very much passionate, even before graduating, about telling the African story. You know, I'm sure you would remember that article of The Economist that basically got all of us outraged about the hopeless continent. The whole idea for us was to say, no, the continent is not hopeless. Actually, the continent is the hope of humanity in the next decades, for the very reason that, you know, we have the youngest population, 60% of arable land, and also some strong values that the Western world might have forgotten along the way, and that would become very handy when S hit the fan, if I may. So, which was based on the sense of community, the sense of Ubuntu that I actually discovered myself later without knowing that I was practicing it, right? So started working with KPMG in Paris. You know, was a very good experience, and it was mostly audit banking, you know, and financial services institutions. So it really, really allowed me to go deep and understanding how the banking sector work, how the financial institutions, insurance, etc., are structured from within. And it turned out to be handy, let's say, 2 decades later when I got into blockchain, right? So that was the early 2000s. So after that, was craving more to be involved in development. Actually kind of was split between joining some non-for-profit organization in Asia or Latin America, like Action Contre la Faim or other, you know, NGOs helping alleviating, you know, human crisis, whether it would be, you know, related to conflict or related to famine, actually, right? And then finally, I decided that I wanted to make more of a structural change than a topical change. So, and with my background, I would have more impact on having a structural impact. So, with, you know, with a finance background and a master in finance, etc., many of my friends from that major actually went to work with, you know, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and so on. And I wasn't so tempted, although there was, you know, the opportunity was there. I thought first I didn't have much of a focus on development or emerging markets that were not, let's say, mature enough. And then, but I still wanted to have an impact through investments and through advisory. And at the time, you know, BNP Paribas, I mean, Fortis then, who were acquired by BNP Paribas, had this Africa division. So I decided, you know, to join them. And it was a very, very good experience because that's when I realized that I could do government advisory, help on privatization, sector restructuring, but I also could do mergers and acquisitions, helping large multinationals expand into Africa, but also helping African emerging leading entrepreneurs, like at the time, Miko Raitare, or we also worked with Negip Sererisa from Orascom, and one in particular also that we worked with was Mo Ibrahim, who founded Celtel that you might have heard of. And the one that is probably most renowned that I worked closely with, you know, as an advisor with our firm and helped him structure his first large project was Aliko Dangote, right? So, and it was a time where, you know, Africa was barely getting into the scene, the international scene as an attractive investment destination. And there was a need that was fairly obvious in terms of accompanying those governments. You know, it was after the structural adjustment plans from IMF, World Bank, and so on. And yeah, so spent quite a few years traveling across the continent and around the world, actually, talking to investors, raising capital for projects, and so on. And on the one that we're working on with Aliko Dangote, on his cement plant, Obajana, we got IFC, the World Bank, actually interested. So we went to Washington, made a presentation, and then after that, the World Bank actually approached me, and which was the director at the time, Thierry Tano, and his team offered me to join the World Bank and IFC in particular, because they had set some great ambitions for Africa, and they wanted people like me to join them. So I went to Johannesburg, to the head office. So I was basically working mostly in Johannesburg, but spending a lot of time in Washington at the headquarters. And when I went to board that plane, I remember my mother telling me, so your childhood dream, it looks like it's coming along. You're going back to Africa and you're going to be working on development, etc. I said, hey, I don't know, but it looks like at least I was true to myself, you know. And I did, you know, a lot of projects. In the beginning, you do a bit of everything, so agriculture, infrastructure. And then I decided to focus on telecom media technologies. Why? For the simple reason that if I looked at my background, right, I also understood that not every child will ever necessarily have that opportunity to be taken on a flight and land in Paris and you know, get the best kind of education in the world and the kind of access I got. So how do we create a level playing field? How do we make sure that everyone get equal opportunity regardless of their wealth at birth or their location at birth, right? So, and technology for me was that equalizer. Technology and telecommunications and education and content were that very opportunity that could make sure that you don't get penalized because of the color of your skin, the origins of your parents, and the land you were born in, right? So I decided to focus on that, telecom media technologies, with IFC and with a mandate, with a development mandate, right? And so as I did that, you know, what was very interesting is that it was the beginning of, so I was part of the early wave of GSM telecommunications, right? Because we basically were advising or raising capital for some of the first telecom licenses in Nigeria with MTN, you know, and many other countries where we basically had to demonstrate to the world when we were pitching it, right? And even before IFC, when I was in, with BNP Paribas in Paris, that actually Africa will leapfrog. And nobody believed us, right? Because so when I would do the whole business plan and the financial model based on assumptions and scenarios, I would go and see some of those big banks or investors in Europe, in America, in the Middle East, and said, okay, we think this country will go to 10% penetration, which means, let's say, go from 0 to, you know, 500,000 subscribers in the next 7 years, right? And everybody were like, look, you know, Africa, you know, this country is barely at, let's say, 100,000 fixed lines, and it did that in 30 years. How do you expect, you know, them to reach 500,000 subscribers in 7? Which is, you know, and I explained that it's the question of opportunity and convenience, right? And of course, so it was hard to raise the capital because there was an asymmetry of information, but reversed, in the sense that we knew the market, we knew what the customers and the people needed phones, because that was the only way to get access, not only to information, but to communicate and trade. So it was a life condition for them. Guess what? After 7 years, you know, our provisions actually were multiplied. I mean, so instead of 500,000, they were at 4 million, right? In most countries, it was 4 times exceeding whatever anybody would have expected. And also because the informal economy is not accounted for at all. So it was a very interesting experience, and I understood then that if we bring technology, people will adopt, right? And why will they adopt is because it's their chance to escape poverty, right? If you create opportunities for people through technology, then it becomes a lifesaver, right? Regardless of the government policy or anything. So as we did that, the next wave for me that I could see coming was mobile money, right? Because at the time, and it was like early 2000, 2004, 3, 4, 5, moving money was a challenge, right? The banking penetration was a problem. It was a cash economy, and you would need like literally cases of cash to make transactions in many places. And there was no infrastructure and quality of roads, etc. So banking the way we knew it, in my opinion at the time, will not fly. You needed to digitize this whole thing, especially that everybody now had many people had a mobile phone, right? And today we're talking about 89% of adults who have a mobile phones. And you're talking about a smartphone penetration in the next 4 years that will reach 3/4 of the population, right? So they have a laptop now. Everybody will have a laptop on their phone. But then point was, how do you effectively transact? How do you, have a chance to send money to someone that is at 100 kilometers without having to wait 3 days for the bank to process it, knowing that you don't even have a bank account? So mobile money. And I made the first investment in the world actually in mobile money. And I was involved in the very early days with the M-Pesa management team when they were starting the project, right? And that for me was a great experience because it was the second time I was proven right.